I'm really excited about this episode as we're going to be talking to Dr. Randal Rauser. And I'd like to welcome you, Randal. And I'm excited to talk to you today. We're going to talk a little bit about your new book. But before we do that, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Thanks for having me, Stephen. So I'm a professor, seminary professor in Edmonton, Canada. I teach in theology, church history, apologetics, and worldview, written 9 books, co-written 3 more. And I tend to focus a lot in areas of worldview and apologetics and theology in my writing, do some debates, podcasts. Well, I used to podcast, blogging, YouTubing, that sort of stuff. 1 daughter, 2 dogs, 1 wife. That's
Wonderful.
the quick one. Yeah.
Yeah. Now the name you go by on Twitter and then on your blog is the Tentative Apologist. What's the story behind that? The word tentative.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the idea here is that while you can still have your convictions, and I certainly do, but you can also express them in a somewhat of a tentative way as you wrestle through the complexities of issues. There's really a couple pieces there, I think, to this idea. And the one is simply in terms of how you hold your beliefs, that you can still have confidence, but also have some room for doubt and questioning. And the other piece is also in terms of engagement with other people, that if you kind of present yourself as being certain of everything, it tends to be off-putting for others, and they're less likely to want to get into a conversation with you. But if you show that you're open to considering new ideas, they might be more open to considering yours. And so I think there's those 2 pieces to it. And so I think tentative for me has been a sort of helpful way to frame how I interact in apologetic exchanges.
I think you're right. I had a conversation recently with someone in my congregation, and she asked me what my view was on a very important topic. And I said to her, you know what, that's a good question, and I'm still trying to work through that. I explained where I had been coming from and then some of the thoughts that I had, but I really hadn't landed on a firm position. And I was a little bit worried that she would think, what are you doing? You're a pastor. You should have all these answers. But she ended up appreciating the fact that I was still trying to figure these things out. And it actually ended up strengthening our relationship and to be able to have good conversations from there, because I wasn't coming from a place of necessary certainty. Now, there's certain things that I am pretty confident of, but there's a lot of other things that we hold pretty loosely. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And now some people, again, are very certain in their convictions, and that's fine. I don't think people have to necessarily question stuff, but I just think some people are wired in such a way that they ask questions and they want to explore, and there's room for that too. And I think that we can have a healthy community if you've got both sides represented, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Now, the book that you wrote is called Conversations with My Inner Atheist. And before we talk about that, I was looking at your list of books, and Atheist appears quite often in that. There's an ongoing theme there of different books that you have written. In fact, I first encountered you, you were recommended to me by an atheist who came to me and said, have you heard of this Randal Rauser? And I'm like, no, I've never heard of him. And so he lent me one of your books and said, you need to read this, because he found your work not necessarily completely convincing, because he's still an atheist today, but he did find it, he was more willing to read what you were saying than what a lot of other apologists were saying. So just to say that's another atheist connection there. But you do seem to have this interest in talking with and about atheism.
Yeah, it has sort of been an ongoing theme. Now, I think probably only 5%, 6% of the North American population is avowedly atheistic. But I think the broader skepticism of organized religion that often comes under the moniker of spiritual but not religious, that's very culturally influential. And even the relatively small number of atheists, I think that in terms of naturalism or the pursuit of natural over supernatural explanations in reality, that is also very culturally influential. And so I find that often I've just been pulled into debates and interactions with people that are atheists, skeptical, humanist, agnostic, that whole sort of spectrum. It certainly comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm. I've enjoyed some of the appearances you've made on the Unbelievable podcast where you've had to defend the atheist position. That was quite interesting to see the reversal of roles there, and then have the atheist try to defend the Christian position. That must have been an interesting experience for you to be able to do that.
Yeah, I've done, I think, 3 devil's advocate debates now where I take on the role of debating the alternative view. And I do really enjoy those because there's no better way to learn what your opponent believes, or your interlocutor, or whatever term you want to use. There's no better way to learn that than to commit to be the one defending it. And generally, I find that when I've offered atheists the invitation to debate and defend Christianity, they're rarely interested in doing so. So I'd like to do more of those kinds of debates because I find them to be a rich way of really getting into the arguments, and also challenging my atheist friends to take a real close look at why people are Christians and see if you can defend that. And so, yeah, I'm a big advocate of that kind of debate.
Mm-hmm. Now, your book, Conversations with My Inner Atheist, as I was reading it, I thought you could read this 2 ways. You could read that as a conversation with a skeptic. Like, you could imagine yourself talking with another person about these things. And then also reading it as the title implies, that this is the atheist in you. These are the questions that are being asked. So with that book and the statements by Mia, being my inner atheist, which I appreciated that, how much of that really was the questions that you had inside, and how much was based on just conversations you've had with other skeptics?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a way to kind of pry those apart, because they're just so seamlessly interwoven with one another. You hear something that is raised as an issue by somebody, you are also wrestling with that yourself. Those 2 objections kind of mingle, and it becomes a deeper objection. And so I think just time and again that the voice of Mia within the book is both my internal wrestling with various topics, and also as I've encountered others outside the Christian tradition or within the Christian tradition who are wrestling with it. And it just all kind of becomes this one voice. So it's a good question. I'm just not sure how to answer it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's probably both and in most cases.
You were talking a little bit before about the role of doubt, and a lot of Christians debate that. Some would say that doubt is the enemy of faith, and we need to avoid that as much as possible. And then others would see it as a healthy aspect of faith. I know in my early years, I spent some time as an atheist from my mid-teens to my early 20s. And so skepticism was a big part of my experience. And then I found myself in a Pentecostal church, and I think you had the Pentecostal background as well. And when I would mention that I had questions and doubts, their immediate role or immediate response was to say, well, we need to cast out the spirit of doubt. That's what we need to do. Rather than answering my questions, they would just lay hands on me and pray that the doubt would go away, which really wasn't that effective. And it took a long time for me to figure these things out on my own. Now, I would say that's not necessarily where all Pentecostals are. And even that particular congregation has come a long way in 25 years. But how should Christians see doubt in their lives? So when a Christian experiences something that makes them question, should they get worried that they're on that slippery slope to becoming an atheist? Or is there a better way to look at that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I give a story in one of my books. I talk about how there's like a bush plane in the Arctic that crashes into the frozen forest, and these 2 guys fly out of the plane and they're left in the snowbank, and then they've got the distress call out, so they're waiting for help to arrive. And the one guy says, I'm in so much pain and I'm so cold and I feel all my joints are aching. And the other guy says, interesting, I don't feel anything at all. And then he just drifts off to sleep in the snowbank. And of those 2 guys, I always say it's the guy who's feeling pain that's in much better shape than the guy who can't feel anything anymore and he just drifts off to sleep. And just as we can think about pain as a helpful signal that your body is communicating with you about certain stimuli in your environment, so doubts can be helpful stimuli for a living faith that they can kind of highlight areas you need to think about more and things you need to wrestle with. And if you don't feel any doubt, it doesn't necessarily mean you're in bad shape, but it could mean you're in bad shape. Just like not feeling any pain could mean you're in bad shape. So I think the first thing we need to recognize is doubt does have a healthy role in the life of the Christian. I recognize as well, however, that there are such things as sort of neurotic doubts that just get to a point where they can become debilitating. And I've met people like that. I mean, Martin Luther, to some degree, may have been like that as he struggled constantly with, and even after his tower experience where he encountered justification anew, he still struggled with the idea that he was really of God's elect. And there can come a point where we too can just struggle to such a point that it becomes debilitating. And those are the moments I think where we need the church to gather around us, maybe offer us some comfort and guidance and assurance, and the Spirit can testify to our spirit. And so we need to seek that. But there is a role for doubt, I think, in the life of the Christian and the Christian community. But there's also a point where it can become unhelpful. And so that's why we need the wider community, and we need to cry out to God in those moments.
Mm-hmm. Now, for you personally, when you are just laying in bed in the middle of the night and a thought comes to mind that really shakes you in terms of faith, is there a particular question or issue, the one that really kind of rattles you? And I realize that's a hard question, so I'll give my answer after you give yours. So I'm going to be as vulnerable as you. But
Sure.
is there one thing that makes you question the most?
For me, I mean, I think, not surprisingly, when it really comes down to it, the problem of evil and suffering in the world in its multiple manifestations is probably the deepest thing that I sort of face and struggle with. It's both for example, the problem of little children dying of cancer, or I mean a little child being sexually victimized by a predatory adult. It's also the evil and the suffering, I should say, of nature, that there is so much suffering just woven into the very fabric of nature. And then suffering and evil as it encounters us, let's say, within the biblical text. So portraits of God within Scripture that I struggle with in terms of understanding how to reconcile God apparently commanding the eradication of entire populations in Canaan, or God commanding punishments such as stoning and the amputation of hands within the Torah, which today we would consider to be inhuman crimes against humanity and not acceptable in a compassionate model of jurisprudence. So it's such a multiple manifestation of evil and suffering that I think about. And I'm just thankful that it hasn't hit me with the depth of the personal grip that it has some other people. So I'll just give one quick example. Probably about 13, 14 years ago, my daughter was missing for about an hour when she was about 4 years old. And I went into meltdown mode. I mean, I couldn't think. And we called the police, and they did a sweep of the house, and they actually found her had fallen asleep under a bed. And so she was fine. But I often think about the parents who have lost a child, right? In those, and the hours turn into days, weeks, and months, and maybe they find that child's body a year later in the woods or something. And how do you come back from that? I don't know. Like, I don't know what would happen to my Christian faith if I did go through that. Some people have a stronger faith as a result, but some lose their faith. And I would hope that I could endure that by God's grace, but my compassion and heart certainly goes out to people who have experienced that kind of suffering and have found a shattered faith as a result.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's difficult for many people. For myself, I think it's the idea of salvation in Jesus alone, which I accept. I have no problem with that. But when then think about that historically. You know,
Mm.
Jesus has died, he's been raised, he's ascended, the Holy Spirit's come down, the church has started. But what about all those indigenous people in North and South America? What about all the people in China who are not going to, there's no possibility for them to hear the name of Jesus for many centuries. Well, I mean, not China, not necessarily, but certainly in North and South America for many centuries. And then when they do hear about Jesus, it doesn't come in a great way anyways. So those are the kind of questions for me that that shake me in the middle of the night. And
Yeah.
there are times you just have to say, you know what, I don't understand it all, but
Mm.
I'm going to have to hold on to what I do know. Now, you wrote this book as a dialogue, and I was curious if you were influenced by Plato at all. Did you like that style of writing? And I know there's a few other apologists have done that kind of thing as well, as opposed to just saying, here's the question, and now I'm going to write a chapter in response.
Yeah, I wrote one other book in this style with a fictional character in a coffee shop, and I also did a dialogue debate book with an actual atheist where we went back and forth in the manner of a dialogue. So I certainly have found that approach to writing and to communicating ideas attractive. Certainly, I've read my Plato back in my university days, and it was impactful then. Since then, I mean, I've also read my share of Peter Kreeft in particular. And so Peter Kreeft's approach, he's often used that Socratic model as well. And I do think it's a very effective way to cover a lot of ground, communicate ideas in a succinct and engaging way, and in a way that it's not just sort of in the seminar classroom, but it's the way you encounter ideas in the realm of life, the way that they kind of just come in the midst of a meandering conversation and suddenly you're wrestling with big questions. So I am attracted to the Socratic dialogue sort of model. Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Peter Kreeft is who I was thinking of too when I was reading that. I recognized that. Now we don't really have time to go through all the chapters there. There were quite a few issues, a pretty wide variety, and some of them, as I read, coming from a different background, I thought that's never really bothered me. But then other ones certainly I saw as being applicable to my own experience. One of the ones that I was drawn to, though, as a pastor, is the chapter that you had on LGBTQ and same-sex marriage, and especially in terms of where the church is at. That, like in my denomination, there would be pastors who would be absolutely affirming of LGBTQ, you know, would not hesitate to include people of that community in all levels of leadership, and it would not be an issue at all. Others would take a far different stance, who would make it probably very uncomfortable for anyone who identifies as gay to be in their congregation. And then, of course, many that would be somewhere in the middle. And this is definitely something that I have worried about for the future of the church, in that how do we hold these tensions together? I'm a Baptist, as you are, and part of the Baptist tradition, and this is what drew me to Baptist, was the idea of soul liberty and trying to figure these things out on your own. And I'm not saying that there's that the truth is all relative, that we're, you know, all sides are true, but we don't necessarily know. We have to have a sense of humility here. But I really have a lot of concern about the future of the church, and how do we respond in compassionate ways that are truthful as well, and having room to agree to disagree on certain things. I was wondering if you could address that just a little bit.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing is, in some ways, it's maybe a little unusual to have a chapter on that topic included within a book that's broadly surveying sort of apologetics issues. But in my experience, dissatisfaction with how the church has dealt with the LGBT question is one of the biggest factors under which many people leave the church today. So I think the place of a conversation about it is really important within a book that's concerned with apologetics broadly. And so my approach within that chapter is not just to give the right answer, quote unquote, but to be able to set up a framework to understand how it is that Christians come to reasonably disagree about this. I mean, I can go back to, it was 1999 when I went to England to do my PhD in theology. And it was the fall of '99 at the small Anglican church that we were going to that I first met a Christian who is gay affirming. I just never encountered a Christian that had that perspective before. I didn't frankly know there were such people. I guess I was a little sheltered. I mean, by that time going into a PhD program, I just wasn't aware that there were people like Boswell and Mollenkott who had been arguing for gay affirming positions for a couple decades by that point. Well, now in the 20 some years since then, I mean, this is a question that is very much on the table. And so at the very least, we need to understand how it is that Christians come to disagree about it. And so I go through the reasons as to the role of scripture, but also other factors, including experience, that do inform how Christians and everybody reasons theologically. So experience informs our reading and our engagement with the key texts such as Romans 1 and 1 Corinthians 6, and our appropriation of the Torah, the law of, for example, Leviticus 18. And so we have to then come to it that it's not simply a matter of who's being faithful to scripture and who isn't, but appreciate that people in good conscience can come to different conclusions on a particular issue. And then I kind of try to cap off that discussion by saying we really need to have a place for hospitality. And I give the example of Pope Francis back in 2013. In his first year in the pontificate, he was chosen Person of the Year by The Advocate, which is the leading LGBT magazine in the world. He had not changed the Catholic Church's position on LGBT issues, but he had begun to speak in a voice of compassion and a sort of invitation rather than just a censoring negative voice. And that alone was enough for The Advocate to say, hey, you're going to be Person of the Year, because so often these are people who've been marginalized by the wider Christian community and hurt. And there is, frankly, a lot of hatred and fear and mistrust of gay people. And we need to recognize that within the church community. And so we do have some healing to do, and we have to learn, among other things, greater hospitality. And I think that would go a long way toward addressing a lot of the skepticism about Christianity today and a lot of the problem of people leaving the church over this question.
Yeah, I definitely think it's an apologetic issue. I have some children in the early teens, and they have lots of people in their classes who identify as gay or bisexual or transsexual, and for them to be told that the church has no place for their friends who are like that. In fact, we had a conversation recently. They had no idea that there were churches that weren't affirming. It never came up. They just couldn't see how a church could be that way. Now, we haven't taken a stand one way or another. It's not something that we've dealt with directly. But yeah, if they had to see that the church was either against that, against everyone who was gay, that's what you had to accept in order to be a Christian, I think that would be a huge stumbling block for them, at least at this stage in their life. So it's a very difficult thing. Now, and another aspect of apologetics, though, and this comes up, I think, in some other chapters as well, that some skeptics will say, if the Bible is true, and if Christianity is true, why do Christians have different interpretations here? It should all be exactly the same if all of these things are true, which I find a little bit puzzling, because as soon as you start reading anything in any other area, like anything non-religious, whether it's science or history, any discipline that's out there, you will find all kinds of disagreements about that. We would never say, well, history has got to be false because there's different interpretations, or science is false because there's, when you look at the say the beginning of the universe purely from like a non-theological perspective, scientists don't have a full agreement as to what's going on. We would not say, well, then the universe didn't begin, or we can't even talk about it. That's a illegitimate subject. So it seems strange to me that religion is the one area that has to have full agreement in order for it to be true. Is that something that you've encountered as well?
Yeah, for sure. There's, I mean, often it sort of comes up in conversation with atheists, or someone saying, well, there's 33,000 Christian denominations. So, which one is the right one? And that, that actually is a statistic that comes from David Barrett's World Christian Encyclopedia. So he does kind of estimate approximately 30,000 denominations. Now, there's a lot more you could say about that. A lot of those are administrative differences rather than theological ones. And of course, there's a huge shared wealth of doctrine and practice between virtually all of those groups. So a lot of the diversity at first, when you get down to it at a deeper level, there's unity or unanimity on essential issues. But here's just a way to kind of present that skeptic's objection. They're saying, well, let's think about Christian doctrine as analogous to the escape route for a hotel in case of fire. Now, what happens if you go to different hotel rooms, and different hotel rooms all have different escape route maps, and they appear to contradict one another at key points? What would that say about the management of the hotel, right? Why doesn't the hotel management make sure there's just one clear escape route for everybody? Unless you adopt a relativist position, right? And you do say, well, relative to this hotel room, this escape route works. Relative to this hotel room, this one works. But if you want to say, no, on these issues, there's one right way to think about it, well, then there should just be one map in all the rooms. And yet within Christianity, to some degree, you get different maps. And so if you look at it that way, I can appreciate how it could be seen as a problem. And there isn't a simple solution, I think. I mean, I did begin to say one here where, well, we can kind of go down and see the deeper unanimity in doctrine. I think one other thing I would say that's quite important is that at the heart of Christianity is not the ability to pass an exam of doctrine. It's not like you get to the gates and St. Peter's there with a theology exam and wants to make sure you pass the exam. Rather, the heart of Christianity is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And it's not ultimately up to me to say precisely which doctrines are required and which are not in order for a person to be in relationship with Jesus Christ, for him to have met them in a salvific way. I can look at doctrine in terms of imposing healthy boundaries for the visible institution of the church, particularly as regards certain levels of participation. So for example, if you want to be the pastor, I expect this degree of assent to doctrine to be part of the package. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to say, well, you've got to believe X, Y, and Z in order to be saved and have a relationship with Jesus. Because that, of course, would just raise the question, well, then which doctrines do you need? And at what age do you need to have them? Because a 4-year-old has different cognitive abilities than a 14-year-old. And you just get into an endless real problem if you want to go down that route. So I'm happy to leave that in the mercy and love of God as he relates to specific individuals. And to say, I think there is some deeper unity that exists beyond the superficial diversity and disagreement.
Mm-hmm. It always, again, confused me about that, because my own experience, I grew up Anglican, went Pentecostal, now Baptist, which are three very different traditions. But I don't see them as a movement of, I was in a false church and then I got into a slightly better church and now I found the true church. They're just totally different traditions. And yes, there are different ways and different doctrines in certain areas, but I recognize it all as being Christian. And as a pastor, I spend a lot of time doing things with pastors of other churches, and it's been a pretty long-term part of my spiritual life to interact with people of all different traditions. And so it's it is a little bit strange, but I guess coming from the outside, I can see where that's coming from. So we've talked a little bit about the doubts. You're laying in bed again. You've just had that doubt that hit your mind. Now, what's that one thing that is going to reassure you about the truth of Christianity? The thing that will ground you in having a strong faith? What's the one aspect, the one concept that holds you?
Well, for me personally, a big thing is to reframe the doubt itself. So the doubt is initially often seems as an enemy, as a problem to be solved. But the way I like to think of it, I sort of touched upon this earlier, that doubts can be thought of as sort of pains to the body, that they're showing that you're engaging with the environment actually in a healthy way. And to follow that through, one thing I like to point out is that the very name of Israel, which goes back to Jacob's wrestling with the angel and then receiving this name, it encapsulates the idea of the person, the community that is willing to wrestle with God. And the very idea of wrestling with God and one's willingness to do so is a sign of intimacy. It is a sign of closeness with this individual. And if we are willing to accept and wrestle through our doubts rather than sort of pretend they're not there, I think that ability to wrestle with our doubts is a sign of the strength of our faith itself, that we are willing to have these hard conversations with God, like the psalmist. Right? When the psalmist gets angry at God, when the psalmist questions whether God has been faithful, when the psalmist cries out as to why he suffers, that is not a sign of impiety. That is a sign of his intimacy with God, that he's willing to have those hard conversations. And I would just say the same thing when we have doubts, is that we should view that as a sign of our intimacy with God. And hopefully then we can begin to reframe and reinterpret what often has seemed to be an enemy of faith, but in fact, I think is a way into a deeper faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been great, Randal. And I really highly recommend Conversations with My Inner Atheist, because we all do have an inner atheist, whether we talk to Mia very often or not. And we might try to push that voice down, but it's there. And so this is a helpful resource for people to work through. And I think it's also helpful for non-Christians just to see that that Christians don't necessarily come from a place of full certainty, and that there is a strength in that, and that we're open to asking those hard questions. So I really appreciate you taking the time to write the book and then to talk about it today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, they can find me online. My website's randalrauser.com. I'm also on Twitter, YouTube, and of course you can find the book at Amazon, as with probably 9 million other books. So yeah. Thanks a lot for having me though, Stephen. It's been a lot of fun.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I hope that people will check you out at your website. You have lots of great content there. I've visited you there often. And I hope that people will come visit me too at stephenjbedard.com. God bless you all.